Dishing out A-level results in the middle of a pandemic was always going to be difficult, but that doesn't excuse a process which has turned into an unprecedented disaster, thrown up arbitrary grades, and dashed the hopes of thousands of young people. On this, the commentariat seem to agree. But the real question should be this. With the poorest hit hardest, is the A-level results fiasco a case of government incompetence or of Tory class war? That is our main topic for tonight. I'm joined by Bastani, as ever, on a Friday. I'll also be speaking later to Qatar-based academic Dana L Kurd on the United Arab Emirates recognizing Israel. And we'll end by discussing the government quietly deleting 1.3 million coronavirus tests from its official tally because, well, they didn't actually happen. Now, as ever, tell your friends about the show tonight. We want to get more people watching live. Share it on Twitter, share it on Facebook, in your WhatsApp groups, or wherever you'd like to share links. I don't know if you can share links on TikTok. First story. Last week, the Scottish government provoked outrage when moderation of A-level grades meant tens of thousands of students missed out on results they were predicted by teachers and which they believed they would have achieved were they to have taken tests. The SNP were eventually forced into a U-turn, and with the Scottish Tories calling for the Scottish Education Minister to resign over the fiasco, many had expected that Gavin Williamson would avoid doing exactly the same thing himself, Gavin Williamson being the UK Education Secretary. How wrong they all were. Gavin Williamson has learned nothing, and after seeing the fiasco unfold in Scotland, has introduced basically or unveiled exactly the same process with exactly the same problems as occurred north of the border. This has all meant that as students received their A-level results on Thursday, they discovered that 40% of them had been downgraded from their teacher predictions. Worse, this was all based on an algorithm, which meant that your grades were essentially decided by how well students had done in the past in your school. So what you achieved in your A-levels was not down to your own effort or your own talent, but was purely a function of how well people had done in your school in the past. ITV yesterday spoke to disappointed students as they received their downgraded results yesterday.
All my teachers predicted us an A in photography and 2 Bs in biology and chemistry, and they've given us a B in biology, a D in chemistry and a B in photography.
How are you feeling right now?
Really upset and annoyed because I would never have got a D or a B in photography. Like, I've never got a D in my life ever. I just don't want a D.
Do you think it's fair?
No, not at all. Like, they said that they weren't gonna like judge us on where we come from and stuff, like on the postcodes and that, but they've still downgraded like the grades when all my teachers like would never give us that. And it even says like what the centre assessed was, and I got A's and 2 B's.
So the grades that my teachers sent off were B, B, C, but I've been given C, D, C, so I've been downgraded in all of them. So that means that I haven't got any uni, they've declined us. Like, I've been given my mock results, which is fair enough because some people have been given less than the mock results, but like obviously you would have improved. We had another 3 months and some of our courses hadn't even finished the content, so it's really frustrating because it's like I would have done better.
So you can see there how much this process has failed students around the country, as we're going to find out, especially that's students from poorer areas of the country or who go to schools which have historically not performed as well as schools where wealthier kids attend. Now, some of the most high-profile cases, some of the ones that have been shared most on Twitter or appeared on the radio, are students who have come from schools where historically you don't normally get very high grades and had places offered to them at top universities, but then when their results came out, it turned out they'd been massively downgraded because previously students at their school hadn't got grades as high as they had got. So one of these students was Mifushan Fiagaraja. He was the first student ever in his school to go to Cambridge or to get accepted to Cambridge. As it stands, he's not going to Cambridge because that's when his predicted A stars were translated into lower grades by the exam board. That offer has been withdrawn. Let's take a look at him speaking to Newsnight's Lewis Goodall last night about his disappointment.
No one's ever gone Cambridge in my school, and yeah, my school was hopeful that I would be the first one to go there, And that's like, I wanted to make them proud. That's why I kept working hard, and I wanted to make everyone that believed in me proud. My parents, my school, and most importantly myself, right? Like, I believed in myself. I knew I could get those grades if I actually did the exams.
So what's happened here? That student was top of his class. Cambridge had judged him, suitable to enter their course, and he was the only student in his school ever who had been offered a place at Cambridge. But the algorithm wouldn't let that be, because what it determined is that if over the past 3 years, it's based on a 3-year average, if the subjects he had taken, the 3-year average didn't allow for anyone to get an A star this year, he would be deprived of that A star. And he was. And this seems to have happened over and over again. I want to get up one more example, which was tweeted yesterday. So hashtag ALevel Results predicted 3 A stars. Exceptionally low performing school. No one had ever achieved a Cambridge offer before in my sixth form. Performed at A star, A star, A star consistently. Today, A star, A, B, dropped 2 grades in sociology, denied Cambridge place. This is what has happened to me. So again, exactly the same thing. What they asked teachers to do was rank their pupils in order of how well they think they would have done in the exams. And then the exam board distributed those kids according to the distribution, or the average distribution, over the previous 3 years. So if your teacher said you were the top of your class and the average for the top of the class over the previous 3 years was a B, you'd get a B, etc., etc. Obviously, this is something that affects working class kids much more than middle class kids at private school, because they will be at schools where it's less usual, where your average grades of your predecessors are going to be lower than your counterparts at private schools or at well-to-do state schools. Now, this is a massive fuck up, but in a sense, and this is not to justify, it's a massive fuck up. They should have 100% found a different solution to this, but you can see how this has happened. It's happened because the government needed to give people grades without them having done the exams. And what they've tried to do is say, we can't have grade inflation, so let's look at how grades are usually distributed, and then we're going to plot kids into those different slots. The idea being that if you let teachers just give grades and accept them, then they will be inflated, and sort of people will basically dismiss this particular round of results. I think what they've done, which is serve great injustices to individuals for the benefit of trying to get some sort of, I suppose, mirror previous results in terms of the distribution of them, it has ended up causing loads and loads of individual injustices. But what the government would claim is that at an aggregate level, this has kept our education system working as it usually would. However, again, that's not the case. So even at an aggregate level, the system, as it's been implemented, has increased inequality. So let's take a look at the changes in A grades and C grades awarded by school type. So you can see here that in secondary comprehensives, the change from 2019 to 2020 in terms of A grades given out increased by 2%. Now you go down to independent schools, and the number of A grades given out in the last year compared to this year has increased 4.7%. And now you go down to sixth form, further education and tertiary colleges, and it's only increased by 0.3%. So what you can see is this system, which was supposed to determine that results would be distributed as they usually were, has actually ended up giving loads more A's to students in private schools than they historically would have got. The same pattern can be seen when it comes to C's. How has this happened? So there is an the government said this isn't just because we wanted to give rich people more grades. What they've said is if you're in a smaller class, then the redistribution of grades was not possible because you can't standardize when they say there's less than 15 people in a particular cohort. But where do you have small cohorts, not many students doing the same subject? Private school. So if there are 14 people doing classical civilizations at a private school, then they'll all fundamentally just get the grade that their teachers gave them because they say, oh, we can't standardize, there's not enough of them. But if you are 100 kids doing maths at a state school, then it will be almost entirely determined by the algorithm, which looks back at previous results and projects that onto current results. Aaron, I'm going to bring you in. This is all pretty outrageous, right? I mean, and the human cost is for all of us to see on our TV screens.
Yeah, it's lovely to join you this evening, Michael. I'm incredibly hot, Maybe you can tell. Maybe you can't. No, for me, this is like a really interesting distillation of Tory Britain, because the ideology is doesn't matter where you're from, doesn't matter who your parents are. You can be like Sajid Javid, son of a bus driver, and become the Chancellor of the Exchequer. You know, you can be from any kind of background and still make something of yourself. But what this is quite explicitly saying, this algorithm, is that actually, no matter how extraordinary you are, no matter how unique you are, no matter how much you deserve to go to somewhere like Cambridge or Oxford or Imperial or wherever you want to go, wherever your heart was set on, wherever your teachers think you're perfectly capable of going, actually, we're going to judge you on your peers and the people that, you know, you live around and the people that are from your community. We're not going to take you on your own personal merits. This is like the complete antithesis of kind of Randian, Ayn Rand, sort of right-wing libertarian capitalists. You know, it's all about the individual determining how they want to live and imprinting, you know, making their mark on society, not allowing the machine of the state to grind them down. That's exactly what the Tories have done here. I mean, that's precisely what has happened here. And it's happened with a bunch of people who love Ayn Rand. It's happened with a bunch of right-wing libertarians in the cabinet. You know, it's an interesting analog to what we see with Trump's America. You know, everything that Alex Jones was predicting, you know, the creation of a federal interior ministry, effectively, the deployment of the military on the streets to pacify internal dissent. That happened. It just happened under Donald Trump. Similar thing here. You know, the nightmare scenario for right-wing libertarians is unfolding before their eyes, and yet they're not saying anything.
I mean, actually, I want to bring up one more stat, because actually this is a comment from a sixth form college, because as I say, this idea of determining people's grades by what people have historically done in their school is objectionable enough. But as we've seen with smaller classes or schools with smaller cohorts doing subjects getting more A's, we seem to have seen, and this is, I can't see how this is possibly explained by the system that the government have rolled out here, that whole colleges have been downgraded. So it's not just that students are being limited by what previous years achieved, but they're getting handed out lower results than what previous years achieved. So this sort of feedback has come from the Sixth Form College Association. They did a survey among their members after the results were released and found 1/3 of responses, so 1 in 3 responses, saying unprompted, this was without being asked, that the calculated grades bore little or no resemblance to performance in previous years, and were often lower. And there is a quote from one sixth form college, which was included in a New Statesman piece. "We would appear to be below our historic data, both at centre and in some cases subject level, and making this year's set of results the college's worst results in the last 15 years. So what you've got there is it's not just that there are individual outlier kids, you know, exceptional kids who are going to a school where you don't normally get people getting 4A stars. It's you're getting whole sixth form colleges where every student there is being downgraded compared to a historical average. So the system was already unjust to begin with. The principles of it are fundamentally wrong, but now the applications of it have intensified all the injustices from the first place. It seems completely unjustifiable to me, and the consequences are quite predictable. So Chris Cook, who used to be policy editor at Newsnight, now at Tortoise, he tweeted today, 2 university officials have told me that they have the poshest cohorts ever this year because privately educated kids got their grades, the university's filled, and there's no adjustment clearing places left to leaven the issue. So yeah, saying obviously if this is advantage kids from private school, then they are going to get the grades. They are going to be getting the grades they need to go to university, and university is going to be more unequal than ever. Now, to get a better idea of this fiasco, how it's being felt on the ground, I spoke earlier today to Arifa Green. She teaches A-level sociology at a sixth form college near Portsmouth. I started by asking her how her students had been affected by this fiasco.
Okay, the grading process has affected my students really dramatically. It's changed the course of the rest of their lives. 81% of my students have been downgraded in my A2 sociology classes. And an example of a student is going from a C to a U. They've worked their asses off the last 2 years and they're devastated.
And so is your understanding that they're being downgraded because they got higher grades, or you predicted them higher grades than what your class got last year? Is that what's gone on here?
we had quite a dramatic change in the intake of students in last year's cohort to this year. So last year we had a large number of students on the course, and the profile of the students was much weaker academically. So this year we were predicting like a big increase in the results, and the much stronger students this year, who should have done much better than last year, have now been held to the same standard as last year's students. So it's been really unfair, particularly for this course this year.
How are your students feeling? I mean, I assume you're getting lots of emails asking, whether or not people can correct their grades. Are you going to appeal?
Yeah, my students have been emailing all day, and I've been providing a lot of pastoral support. They're devastated. They've worked so hard. And for a lot of them, it's going to impact them for the rest of their lives because they're not going to university. Like, my students are going out into the workplace. Some of my students are already parents, teenage parents, and some of my students are homeless, and they just want to get a job, a decent job. They can't go to uni. So these grades are going to have an impact on them immediately.
And in terms of appealing, so you've got students who you think should have got a C, they've ended up getting a U. Is there any chance that they can correct this under the current system?
We've had some issues with appealing. The students feel really intimidated by the process of appealing, like working class students. My students tend to feel really out of their depth, like challenging any kind of systemic issues. Also, there's the issue of cost. One of my students was like, Arif, for me and my single mum, we can't appeal. Like, that's sort of beyond our level, and we can't pay for it either. So I don't know how we're going to support the appeals, to be honest.
Finally, what about your students who are going to university? Are there people who have lost university places, or do you think that universities are generally being understanding?
Most of my students don't go to uni because we live in like an area with really high levels of deprivation. But my students that are going to uni have seen their offers changed from their universities to like unconditional offers. Because they're applying to ex-polytechnic, sort of quite low on the league table universities. So they've been quite quick to change the expectations and show the students that they believe in them and that they think the results are not necessarily reflective of the work they've put in.
That was Arifa Green, A-level sociology teacher. I think a few really important points raised there, and one that I've seen sort of talked about less in the mainstream media. I don't necessarily think this is ideological. It's just because of the class background that journalists tend to come from, is this focus on whether or not kids have got into their preferred top-level university. And so the argument then quite quickly shifts to the idea that maybe the universities could be a bit more understanding. You have had Worcester College from Oxford now come out and say, we are not going to change our offers based on what grade this algorithm have pumped out. They've basically said, if we gave you an offer and you didn't meet the grades, it doesn't matter because we don't really have much respect for these grades anyway. But what isn't getting noticed quite so much is the kids, and 50% of kids in this country don't go to university, for whom these A-level grades are not just a stepping stone for another qualification, they're going to be your highest level of qualification. So these are going to be the grades that you take with you throughout your life when you're trying to get a job or you're trying to get a promotion. And because of this incredibly unjust system, people who worked really hard to get free C's or to get an ABC ended up getting D's and U's and E's, right? And that is really hard to fix unless there is a U-turn from the government. I want to bring you back in on that, Aaron, on that interview. I mean, it's really, the idea that you've got a teacher who works so hard for her students, and then the students are sort of emailing saying, like, we're really disappointed with all of this. And then the other point as well, which is super interesting, is this idea that, yeah, it's all very well saying there's an appeal process, but who is it who feels comfortable using appeal processes? Who is it who says, like, I deserve higher grades than I got, and I know how to use this system, and I am going to contact the exam board myself and make sure I get what I deserve? That tends to be more confident middle-class kids who are used to making systems work for them. If you are not from that group of people, then you get these disappointing results. You say, there'll be people blaming themselves for these low results, right?
There'll be many kids who won't even realize they have a right to appeal, or that they may hear those words, but they won't recognize it as something they can execute. And that's really, really important. I remember being 18, 19 myself when I went to university. Neither of my parents had been for an undergraduate degree. and they wouldn't have been able to help me. You know, it's just a matter of fact. Maybe a teacher in the school might be able to help you, but are they going to help you raise the money? You know, and so there's many things wrong with this system. On the one hand, you know, it is true. We've touched on it, but we really have to impress this point that teachers do generally. That they're overconfident with the predictions of the kids' grades. So when we say that, oh, well, many people are seeing their predicted grades come down, I mean, that in a sense, that's reasonable. The point is as you've very lucidly articulated, you know, it's not happening equally. That's coming to the advantage of wealthier people. So at the very least, if we're saying here that one of the negative consequences is that poorer kids are impacted more than wealthier ones, surely that's a really strong argument to make a right to appeal free. And that's what I find really just astonishing. If you're gonna basically make somebody's life opportunities contingent on something as arbitrary as an algorithm, as arbitrary as this is incredibly arbitrary, and it has to be. But if you're going to make something as, you know, as so important, like you say, for some people for the next 50, 60 years, for the rest of their working lives, they'll be saying, I got X, 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 you know, these are hugely significant qualifications for them. Clearly there has to, not just a free, you know, appeals process, very, you know, eagerly signposted. Please, if you don't think you've got a fair, you know, result here, please appeal. Because we want something which is as commensurate as possible with what the actual results would have been. And, you know, this sounds like a reasonable system. You know, it's like it clearly works against people from poorer backgrounds, from schools which haven't done so well in the past. Maybe that could be mitigated. I don't know. Clearly, one way of doing it is with the appeals process. And I just think, you know, Labour have said it. And you think, how much would it cost maybe for a couple of 100,000 kids? You're not talking huge money here. It's £100 an appeal. But for those families, it's an immense amount. That means they can't put food on the table that week.
We're going to go to some comments. Pencil Powley says, I'm so angry for the kids who've been fucked over by this classroom warfare. Indeed. Agreed. Monica Weedman with a £10 super chat says, the German A-level tests were not cancelled. Tents were put up. Space was found so that the social distancing was maintained. Why could that not happen here? That's a really interesting point. I didn't actually know that. Because, I mean, I agree with what Aaron is saying, which is that, you know, there is some logic to this. You can see why you wouldn't necessarily just take the teachers' grades as gospel. But at the same time, I think even if they didn't have the sort of class effects, which we've already described, it would still be completely unjust to give individuals grades based not on their own actions and their own performance, but based on the performance of different children in a different year. So I think even if you do get rid of the class discrimination from this, it is, you know, I think we've all learned it's just an essentially unfair way of dishing out assessments which have a real impact on your future. And so I think the Germans having a way of doing that, of making those tests go ahead is interesting. I mean, again, I can see why the government were thinking, let's just cancel the exams, because one, they were in the middle of a national crisis. That would have created, again, lots of new, different challenges for teachers, and also probably quite a lot of stress for kids. So if you've got kids who are locked down in their homes, not able to go to school, potentially it's overcrowded, and they then have to cram for GCSEs in June, that could have made a stressful situation even more stressful. But obviously we're in a very unideal situation now, and presumably actually the Germans could get away with that kind of thing because their lockdown was less severe, because they went into it earlier and they were less wholly irresponsible in allowing coronavirus to move so quickly around the population. And Beat Surrender tweets on the hashtag TiskiSour, today's impromptu protest was actually organized by teachers. There was huge solidarity and respect between students and many taking part. Many speakers spoke about this fight in a bigger context. That's how we win, in solidarity and standing together. It's all our fight. Good comment. I mean, it was interesting those demonstrations happened today. I haven't actually seen many images of them yet. We're going to move on to the politics of this in one moment. First of all, make sure you share the stream. We want to get more people watching on this Friday evening. So I want to go back to the politics of this, because obviously a very similar situation happened last week in Scotland, and we can see how that story developed. So there was huge outrage, many kids desperately upset, people who recognized that there was a sort of class inequality going on in how these results had been distributed, and it ended up that the government were forced into a U-turn. So let's take a look now at Nicola Sturgeon earlier in the week admitting that she got this wrong.
But our concern, which was to make sure that the grades young people got were as valid as those they would have got in any other year, perhaps led us to think too much about the overall system and not enough about the individual pupil. And that has meant that too many students feel that they've lost out on grades that they should have had, and also that has happened as a result, not of anything they've done, but because of a statistical model or an algorithm. And in addition, that burden has not fallen equally across our society. So despite our best intentions, I do acknowledge that we did not get this right, and I'm sorry for that.
So that was Nicola Sturgeon, who has done a U-turn. But again, I think she explained, I mean, I think they fucked up and they should have seen beforehand that this was going to happen. But if you're going to do a U-turn, which was the right thing to do in this situation, I think Nicola Sturgeon there explained in a very articulate way what was the problem with the system, that even though on an aggregate level, it could look somewhat fair, on an individual level, it created these huge injustices. And so it's better to accept 20% grade inflation this year than to have kids whose outcomes are determined not by their own actions, not by their own talent or their own effort, but by the effort of other people. Now, the Tories, after that U-turn was made in Scotland, they didn't welcome the U-turn. They continued to call for the Scottish Education Secretary to resign. They said, this is a huge mess up and they have to stand down. However, their tune, the Scottish Tories' tune, has somewhat changed since the party in Westminster made exactly the same error 1 week later. So today they deleted this tweet, or potentially yesterday. So Scottish Conservatives, Nicola Sturgeon presided over one of the biggest scandals in the history of devolution, which shattered the life chances of thousands of Scottish pupils. Her belated apology is not good enough for the teachers, parents and pupils who were affected by this fiasco. So that's what they tweeted out when the SNP gave out results based on an algorithm which created loads of individual injustices. The moment the Conservatives do it, even though they had forewarning this time because they'd seen how badly it was received in Scotland, they just delete the tweet, pretend we didn't say that. So much for principles. Labour, for their part, have called for grades to revert back to the predictions. So they are now saying what the SNP did, the result of the U-turn, let's do that here. I think that's a fairly reasonable position, but Gavin Williamson has ruled it out. So there's going to have to be more pressure to make this happen. Aaron, do you think this situation can hold? Obviously, the Conservatives, you say it's against Conservative ideology to have sort of people's background determine their future, but it's against their explicit ideology. It's sort of the underlying feature of most of their policies. So maybe they think they can ride this out just as they rode out, I suppose, for example, Dominic Cummings breaking the rules and so many other features of this government.
Yeah. I just want to clarify, earlier on I said that you have to pay for appeals. It's a resit that's £111. Appeals cost the school more than £100. I don't know if they can happen at the instigation of the pupil, whereas a resit can. This, of course, depends on where you are, England, Wales, and the examination board. I mean, this would be tough for a solicitor to get their head around, right? But, for a 17-year-old kid, 18-year-old kid, and that maybe their family's never gone to university before, examination boards, this much money, well, if it's successful, unsuccessful, just unbelievable. I don't know, Michael. I really don't know. I think they can get away with it. I think that the last 40 years in politics has seen people recognize that they can't change things. There are broader forces at play, which means they're deprived of agency. And that's been the essence. Oh, well, that's life. The government doesn't do anything. It just screws up. And so I don't think there'll be any political overhead for the Tories unless Labour does something about it, or unless there is a mass movement of the kids involved. I think this fatalistic, in the next general election, these kids will get the Tories up. No, they won't. Over the 65s have determined every single general election for 30, 40 years. That's not to say that, people like you and I won't determine a general election one day. It just probably won't be for a decade or two. So, the political overhead, I'm not so sure. I really don't know. I mean, ultimately, it favours their base. Kids from private schools have done extraordinarily well. Young people vote Labour anyway. I really don't think I don't know. I mean, I saw my Paul Mason's sort of bellicose tweet last night saying to Labour voters in the Red Wall, your kids have been disadvantaged. to help kids from Eton and Harrow. I mean, they probably already knew that. I mean, without being, A, don't tell off the people whose votes you need, but B, I mean, they know the Tories sort of work for the elite. Unless you've got an alternative coming from the party of opposition, so what?
But I suppose there's a difference between, even if you are, think there is justice to an unequal society, you still usually have some sort of respect for the idea of fair play. And as you say, the results here are so counter to the ideology that the Conservatives sell, which is that, you are going to be, your success will be determined by your own individual effort. And this sort of trashes all of that and will have affected many people. I know I hate doing this sort of Westminster bubble talk, but in the red wall, these seats which they do want to win the next general election. I want to bring up Wales.
They individualize, Michael, can I say,
go on.
They individualize it. Oh, this is outrageous. What are you going to do about it? Well, they have a right to appeal. They can resit. You get this huge macro social political phenomenon, and you individualize and you put responsibility at the feet of the individual. It's for families and the young adults involved to decide whether or not they'd like to appeal or to resit. And that's what they'll do. That's what they've done for 30 years.
To be honest, that is very persuasive when you put it like that, where it's not just that, they'll individualize the solution. So whereas Nicola Sturgeon in Scotland was willing to say, look, I made a mistake, we as a society are going to change course. The Conservatives are not going to admit, well, we don't know, we might get proved wrong in a week, but they're going to be very reluctant to admit that the government was wrong, and they are going to individualize this and say, if you're upset, as you say, you can appeal or you can go get an exam, but it's ultimately up to you. What I wanted to point out with Wales is that what's interesting about this policy is you've got 3 different parties in each of the different nations in government. So in Wales, it's Labour in government. In Scotland, the SNP in government. And in England, the Tories. You know that already. And all of them have implemented a very similar system. But what's going to determine, the politics of each of those parties, and I suppose the accountability of each of those governments, is what happens afterwards. So the SNP and the Tories here made a very similar mistake. The SNP U-turned. Will the Conservatives? We don't yet know. And the Welsh government, again, it was very similar, the situation to the English government. There, they didn't abolish AS levels. So you remember Michael Gove got rid of AS levels and coursework so that students' entire time at college was assessed in a few essays. I think it was all to try and make it sort of like Oxford University, very high stakes, very high stress, completely unnecessary. It's backfired. So Wales were in a slightly stronger position to estimate grades, but still, again, we might see a U-turn forced.
I love
any more on this topic, Aaron?
I did AS levels. I loved them.
I agree.
Why
make education unnecessarily stressful? It seems completely bizarre to me. Unless people get stressed and depressed, it's not really education. Is kind of the Tory.
But this is, can I just say, this is something with Conservative policy, particularly after 2010. Often people say, "Oh, would you do this? Is this a good policy?" A lot of the time, just leave it. You don't need to change something. We need dramatic change in a couple of areas, like housing, right? Clearly, we probably want to at least bring down university tuition fees with an eye to getting rid of them very quickly. There's a bunch of things you probably want to do. But the Tories just go in and Conservative, right? Reforms that you may preserve. That was the Lord Macaulay. That was the adage. That was meant to describe 19th century conservatism.
Well, it's also the Gove Cummings thing, right? Which is make changes even if you don't really know why you're doing it.
It's precisely. It's the opposite of small c conservatism. That's not my ideology, but it's quite coherent. Often it's a sensible way to govern. But the Tories don't do that either. They don't do the radical utopianism. Let's try and help one another. Let's get systems that really fit for the 21st century. And they don't do the gently. Don't mess things around too quickly. They do this. I don't know what they do, Michael. But look, they've been in charge for 10 years and it doesn't seem to be changing anytime soon.
We've got a couple of comments. Awesome Everton with a £5 super chat. I get my GCSE results next week. My heart goes out to A-level people. Also keep it up, guys. There was a Guardian story today. I mean, obviously, good luck to you. Solidarity. I hope those results come out as you would like them to be. And again, this will affect people, and the distribution of effects when it comes to this outrage will be not very uniform. But the Guardian did report today that there's going to be 2 million grades downgraded when it comes to the GCSEs, and the impacts are going to be even more unequal or inequitable than for A-levels. So unless there is some very quick action from the government on this, we might be about to see this particular outrage on steroids. John Simpson tweets on the hashtag Tisky Sour, feels like there's enough pressure for another U-turn. Fingers crossed. Very much so. I do hope so too. And also thank you to Lou Radford with a £5 super chat and Rich Williamson with £2. Thank you very much. We do appreciate all of those super chats. It helps this organization grow. We're going to move on to our next story in one moment. First of all, please do subscribe to the channel. It means that you find out every time we go live. Oh, actually, that's only if you turn notifications on. So also turn notifications on. But I'm especially obsessed with you subscribing because I want to get over 100,000 by the end of the summer. I'm going to include September in summer now. Next story. On Thursday, Donald Trump celebrated what he called a historic diplomatic breakthrough between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, in which the UAE agreed to normalize relations with Israel in exchange for Israel suspending its plans to formally annex vast swathes of the Palestinian territories. Let's take a look at Trump explaining that agreement.
Just a few moments ago, I hosted a very special call with two friends, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed of the United Arab Emirates, where they agreed to finalize a historical peace agreement. Everybody said this would be impossible. And as you know, Mohammed is one of the great leaders of the Middle East. After 49 years, Israel and the United Arab Emirates will fully normalize their diplomatic relations. They will exchange embassies and ambassadors and begin cooperation across the board and on a broad range of areas, including tourism, education, healthcare, trade, and security. This is a truly historic moment. Not since the Israel-Jordan peace treaty was signed more than 25 years ago has so much progress been made towards peace in the Middle East. By uniting two of America's closest and most capable partners in the region, something which said could not be done, this deal is a significant step towards building a more peaceful, secure, and prosperous Middle East.
Yeah, he has a funny way of reading out these big, significant announcements because he never looks up. You have no idea whether he understands what he's saying. It looks almost as if he's doing a sort of reading test that you do in primary school. You just read out the words and the teacher tells you if you got them right or not. But anyway, that's besides the point. Trump, the Israelis, they're all claiming this to be a diplomatic victory, as are the United Arab Emirates. The Palestinians, though, as usual, have been relegated to an afterthought. The Palestinian Authority, alongside Turkey and Iran, have denounced the Israeli United Arab Emirates agreement. So to get some more detail on this story, I spoke earlier to Dana L Kurd. So Dana is an assistant professor at the Doha Institute of Graduate Studies and author of Polarized and Demobilized: Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine. I started our conversation by asking whether the suspension of Israeli plans for annexation would have any benefits at all for the Palestinian people.
So I would say that there's very little difference on the ground in terms of Israel, committing to an annexation date or committing to suspending it for the time being now that they've made peace with the UAE. Basically, what's been happening on the ground is annexation as an ongoing process, kind of de facto, if not de jure, in the sense that Israel continues to expand its settlements and essentially annex more and more Palestinian land, which made the viability of a two-state solution and a viable Palestinian state basically non-existent. So in terms of this whole narrative of, oh, Israel gave something up, they suspended annexation for the time being, so such a win for Palestinians, it's really not the case.
For agreeing to suspend annexation, which you don't think is very significant, what they got is normalized relationships with the United Arab Emirates. Is that a significant loss for Palestinians? What difference does that make to the conflict? I
would say that it is a loss in terms of its variations in significance, and I'll explain what I mean. It's been an ongoing process that the Palestinians have become sidelined in their own conflict. Israel has attempted and is succeeding in trying to create relationships with Arab states that are not built on the ending of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a way that's suitable to Palestinians, both on the ground and Palestinian leadership. So in that sense, this is a loss because the Arabs, one of their few remaining bargaining chips, was the fact that they were not normalizing relations with Israel. Now, there was always under the table, normalization and under the table coordination with many of these states, but that was still, there's only a few states in the region that actually have official ties with Israel. The rest of the region does not. And what this does is it creates a precedent for particularly countries in the UAE access to also normalize relations with Israel. And so what have they gained? Nothing. And what have they lost? Their only bargaining chip in the Arab-Israeli conflict, which, according to the Arab Peace Initiative, was predicated on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict coming to a fruitful conclusion, not the sidelining of Palestinians in a non-viable state.
And do the Palestinians have any allies left in the region, or do you see them as becoming just more and more isolated?
I mean, especially after the Iraq War, if we're going to take it that far, but especially after the Arab Spring, the Arab region has suffered significant setbacks, and the Arab people have suffered significant setbacks in terms of demanding democratic governance, in terms of international and regional intervention in many of these Arab countries, such as Iranian intervention in Iraq and Turkish intervention in a number of states, as well as the crackdowns that occurred after the Arab Spring. So it makes a little bit of sense that the Palestinian cause and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not at the forefront of people's minds. However, if I were to answer your question, what allies do we have left? It's not going to be the governments, these unrepresentative, repressive governments. It's going to be the Arab people. We have lots of polling data as late as 2018, which is through the Arab Opinion Index. That shows that Arab citizens are very supportive of the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people. And if there was actual democratic governance in the region that represented these views, then we'd have many allies. So I still have hope, at least in the people of the Arab region, and those are our true allies.
That was Dana L Kurd, Assistant Professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies and author of Polarized and Demobilized Legacies of Authoritarianism in Palestine. I want to go for your thoughts on that interview, Aaron. I thought that final point actually was, it's obvious. I feel like I should have considered it before, but this idea that the Arab states are sort of falling away from a strong advocacy of the Palestinian cause, partly just because of their fundamental weaknesses, not necessarily because of what faction is in power, but the fact that you have the Arab Spring, you have the Iraq War, and suddenly there's battles on so many fronts, and the politics is so, I suppose, chaotic in ways, not necessarily the best way to describe it, but this idea that they all end up just being peeled off, and the Palestinians, other than Arab populations, end up pretty isolated.
Yeah, I mean, Rashid Khalidi, who I interviewed a few months ago on Novara Media, has done a great piece of history on what he was 100 years of war against the Palestinian people, starting from the Treaty of Versailles, the Balfour Declaration, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, all the way through to today, and it has multiple stages. And actually, this is quite a perennial feature of that. It's not a new thing. Time after time, we see dynasties, actually, unelected leaders tend to be monarchs, doing precisely this to the Palestinian people. Lip service is paid towards the cause, but actually they act in a very contrary way. We've seen it previously with Egypt. We've seen it, I think Saudi Arabia normalized relationships in the 80s. Rashid's book details all of this. Slowly but surely, like you say, they've normalized relations with people who really matter.
Officially, it's just Egypt and Jordan. But there's something formal diplomatic relations, but there's obviously loads of Arab states which have, ultimately friendly relations with Israel.
There is something which changes in the 80s with Saudi. I can't remember what it is. It's in the book. It's after the South Lebanon War in '82. But in any case, there's a real transformation in these relations, quite fundamentally after the mid '60s as well, because the Arabs recognize actually they're not going to be able to just push over the Israeli state. They've given it a good effort a couple of times, and in a military conflict with Israel, has a conscript army, incredibly well trained, incredibly well armed. They don't really stand a chance, and the Russians aren't that keen in helping them either, and making a proxy war. So that's the choice they make. There are a few exceptions. The Iranians, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, its extraterritorial wing called the Al Quds Force, which means the Jerusalem Force. They're quite explicit in their the sort of religious base of what they're doing. Now, you might say that's for political expediency at home. I'd agree with that. But the point is they're doing that whilst the regimes such as the UAE, such as Egypt, aren't. So we'll see. But, I mean, Arab populations, these publics are being ignored. But, I mean, they've been ignored for decades. I mean, what does that mean in terms of Western coverage? When a Saudi monarch dies, we fly our flag at half-mast. When you have a member of the Muslim Brotherhood elected as the president in a democratic election and then overthrown by a General Al-Sisi, Mohammed Morsi, who was in prison. Al-Sisi then becomes the president as a result of effectively a military coup, despite having significant, consent from the public. We invisibilize Arab publics and we eliminate, I think, from any kind of discussion, sort of what the Palestinian people have to say. So what does this do? I mean, it does make you laugh. We will have this normalization of relations with the UAE. We'll defer annexation. We're like, well, hold on, that's quite a big deal. You should at least say we won't do it. There's not much of a carrot for the UAE. And by the way, this is how deep the UAE's pan-Arabism goes. They've lost at least 100 soldiers fighting in Yemen alongside the Saudis, right? That's how much the UAE and its regime care about Arabs, right? When you've lost 100 of your own soldiers, when you're using F-16s against people that have got Kalashnikovs. That's the kind of regime you're dealing with in July.
I mean, what I find frustrating with this is how successful it seems Netanyahu has been at shifting the Overton window. So even the most meaningless concession to say, I was going to do this incredibly extreme thing that's illegal under international law, but actually now I'm going to defer it for a few months. And then you have all of the globe's, liberals, conservatives, everyone saying, oh, this is brilliant. Oh, it's so brilliant that they've made this concession. So that should never have even been on the table. And you see, even from sort of the Labour Party on this, their policy hasn't been terrible when it comes to Israel, Palestine. They talked about putting sanctions on the occupied territories. But this idea that you sort of say, this is brilliant, it's great that the Israelis have said they're not going to formally annex Palestine, but also we need to work towards a two-state solution. It's such a bland statement. I mean, this should be an opportunity to talk about how annexation is de facto happening, even if it's not de jure happening in the next few months. I mean, how low are we setting our standards for how Israel should behave in relation to Palestine? We're going to go on to our final story of the evening. Oh, Aaron wants to come in on this first.
Quickly, I mean, look, compare this to Russia, right? Russia annexes quite similar in terms of what's going on with Israel-Palestine in many ways. They annex a piece of land in a way that's not very common in the 21st century. And rightly, this creates uproar across, Western governments and across OECD countries. And they don't just say, oh, we're going to have, sanctions on the bits of Crimea occupied by Russia. They say, we're going to have sanctions on the Russian economy. We're going to make sure that your domestic economic elite are going to be really pissed off with their political class for this. We're going to make it bite. But then, I think it really does get to the heart of the duplicity on this when you see that, compare Russia and Crimea, the diplomatic kickback, the extent of the sanctions, how quickly it happened. And then you have Labour, and also Labour and it's good. It's good that they're talking about sanctions on the settlements. That's good. But they say it was actually, and we are, we call it out. We will insist there are sanctions on the settlements for this illegal annexation of a territory which doesn't belong to them by any international law out there. So, I mean, it's just, it's startlingly absurd. But when you see this reported by the BBC, I'm sure most people watching that story, listening to that story, reading that story, go, this doesn't feel like a fair trade. I mean, am I missing something? But that spin is very rarely given by their diplomatic correspondents or their political correspondents.
I agree with all of that. We're going to go on to our final story. First of all, do go to novaramedia.com/support and donate the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month so we can continue growing this show, growing this organization. As you know, everything we do is only possible because of your kind support. In COVID news, a few developments today. We haven't talked about it that much this week, actually. So we've got a further loosening of the lockdown. If you're a fan of indoor theatre, music, or general performances, they will be reopening. You'll be able to go inside and watch those events with socially distanced audiences. Wedding receptions are back on in the form of a sit-down meal for up to 30 guests. The piloting of a small number of sporting events to test the safe return of spectators will resume, commencing with the final of the World Snooker Championship. I don't know why that's the first sporting event we're bringing back in. That's the most boring spectator sport that probably exists. Casinos, bowling alleys, skating rinks, and soft play centres will be allowed to reopen. And close contact beauty services such as facials, eyebrow threading, eyelash treatment, makeup application, and microblading will resume. And pilots are going to take place at conference venues to aim towards the resumption of business from the 1st of October. There's actually conferences, which were one of the main sort of super spreader events for coronavirus. That was, at the beginning, everyone was like, why is it all the sort of elites? Why is it, celebrities, politicians? Why is it all these people who are getting coronavirus? Normally illnesses hit, the poorest the hardest. Obviously, ultimately, it ended up doing so. Obviously, it was the poorest who ended up dying most from coronavirus. But at the beginning, the people super spreading were people attending conferences. So maybe a bit risky to start this again. Obviously, these changes aren't going to occur where there are local lockdowns in place. Leicester, Preston, East Lancashire, parts of West Yorkshire, Greater Manchester and Aberdeen. But as ever, the question comes, why is this happening now? Is this happening now because some scientists have decided that it's now safe to open conference centres and start bowling and have performances indoors? Or is the government being motivated by something wholly different? And on Radio 4 this morning, John Edmonds, so he was one of the two leading modelers on Sage, the other being Neil Ferguson, who had to resign, which I suppose means John Edmonds is now the leading modeler on Sage. He was, and we can go to a tweet by LBC producer Ava Santina for this one. He was asked on Radio 4 what has changed in the science to allow a further ease of lockdown measures. And Sage member John Edmonds simply says, nothing. I don't think it's been taken on epidemiological grounds. It's been taken primarily for economic reasons. Aaron, how should we, what's your take on this? Do you do whatever the government, do you think if the government makes it possible or if it's allowed to go bowling, do you think it's morally permissible to go bowling? Or do you think people should be more, I suppose, conservative in the small c sense than the government on this?
I mean, that was the whole point of Eat Out to Help Out, right? It was that, okay, well, the restaurants and the bars are reopening, but people don't really want to go there. Okay, well, let's give them an additional incentive. So, I mean, it's less a moral question, I suppose, looking at that, predicting how will it play out. I mean, they're going to see significantly lower numbers of attendees than they otherwise would have.
Personally, we might get vouchers for all of these things.
Pardon?
We might get vouchers for all of these things.
I mean, that would make sense. I mean, if that's what they want to do, but I mean, maybe. I mean, Eat Out to Help Out in that respect. Having people congregate indoors when they, ideally should be taking food out. I mean, it is a stupid policy. However, it has worked. It's been a boon to hospitality and catering this month, and that might buy them a couple of months for many businesses. A couple of months from bankruptcy. So, would I do it? I mean, it's hard. It's difficult because the hard and fast rules don't necessarily apply. 9 times out of 10, I probably wouldn't. Maybe the 1 time in 10, I'd be like, okay. I've been very good 95% of the time. That's how I kind of do it. I'll hug my dad knowing I shouldn't really, and I'm allowed to. But I don't know. What about you? I also, Michael, I'm a boring guy these days. I stay in, I read. I mean, you're always hosting Tisky. Where
I've
are you?
got no time to go bowling. There's no bowling league for me to get back into. What?
Who goes bowling?
I suppose, I don't know. We're going to go on to our...
I thought it was just in the 80s bowling.
Fox is saying Tisky is my bowling, but it's nothing like bowling. I'm definitely not going to catch coronavirus in here. Right. Next, we're going to go on to something else we've learned about coronavirus this week. So the government's counting of many things have been one of the most sort of cynical, egregious aspects of their approach to coronavirus. So whether this is in terms of PPE and them counting gloves individually, sheets of tissue paper, and they say we've got 2 billion pieces of PPE going out. I think that was one low moment. The other is when it comes to testing. So obviously the government was fairly embarrassed at first that we were so slow to roll out testing. Then Matt Hancock made that sort of impromptu announcement that we were going to get up to 100,000 tests at the end of, I can't remember what month it was now, April maybe. And to reach that target, they ended up having to completely change how they counted everything. So suddenly it turned out that instead of a test being counted if it was in the lab, a test was counted as having been done that day if it was posted out that day. So we ended up going from sort of 30,000 at the beginning of the week to 100,000 at the end of the week, just because they've been manically posting out tests, which may never have been taken. And what we found out today, though, is that it wasn't just that they shifted to counting tests which had been posted out as tests which had been done that day, but even then, they were double counting loads of those tests. So it turns out that they have had to, this week, quietly delete 1.3 million COVID tests from England's tally. Obviously, again, this is a much less salient issue now. So for them to say, oh, actually, they didn't happen after doing a huge fanfare about making their target, their 100,000 target, back in May. Smart politics, but it's incredibly dishonest politics. We can go to some copy for that. Department for Health and Social Care said the changes affected data reported between the 14th of May and 12th of August. It said there had been a double counting of test kits that had been dispatched, which had not been removed from the lab's processed data. The changes were made after it was discovered fewer in-person Pillar 2 tests had been carried out than originally reported, while more tests had been sent to NHS trusts and care homes. The problem was acknowledged by the Department for Health and Social Care on 6th of July, but tests were removed from the data on the 12th of August. So again, you've got 5 weeks between them recognizing the error and taking them out. But again, I mean, this is taking 1.3 million tests away from what was already a completely inflated and meaningless figure, because a test hasn't been done when you put it in the post box. And finally, to wrap up our coronavirus roundup, sounds a bit macabre. So the UK now, if you're watching from France, you better quarantine if you come back to this country. Last night, the UK hastily announced that there would be new quarantine measures for people coming back from France and Holland, because cases are up in those countries. So on Thursday, so yesterday, 2,669 people tested positive for COVID-19 in France. And that's the 4th time in a week the number has exceeded 2,000. For comparison, in the last 24 hours, the UK reported 1,441 new cases in a day. Now, again, this is the kind of story where I kind of leave it to the epidemiologists. I would prefer, when we suspect the R number to be going up in France, that we impose some sort of quarantine on people who are coming back from there. It all seems kind of a bit irrational, because I don't feel like when the government told people, it's fine to take a holiday now, they said it might well turn out that once you arrive at holiday, once you arrive, in your destination, you could get told a day before you come back that you're then going to have to quarantine for 2 weeks. I think people would have made slightly different decisions if that had been made clearer. But anyhow, from the BBC article on this story, there was an interesting comment from a holidaymaker, I suppose, on what could be some of the unintended effects of these last-minute changes to policies when it comes to travelers. So Tom Duffel, who's in France, who runs a small business, cut short his holiday to Nice with his wife and 2 children by 4 days and booked a last-minute flight home. We were enjoying a nice cocktail last night, and suddenly a news flash pops in and a scramble to book flights, he said. We've had to spend about £800 because we can't afford to take another 2 weeks off work. He added that social distancing had gone out of the window in the scramble for transport, with huge queues at the airport. So it's that final comment, which I think is the most relevant one. And this article was full of people saying, yeah, I mean, everywhere is rammed because everyone is so desperate to get back to the UK. They sort of gave a 36-hour window between the announcement and arriving back in the UK. So if you got to the UK in that next 36 hours, you wouldn't have to quarantine. If you got any later, you would. People rush back because they can't afford to stay in their home for 2 weeks. They want to get back to work. And then what you end up with is these really chaotic scenes at sort of pinch points, either on Eurostar or at the ferry, and which could be potentially a real breeding ground for COVID-19. Aaron, I know you're not taking a holiday, but this does seem, obviously it's going to have some adverse unintended effects, but this process of sort of, I suppose, keeping an eye on COVID levels, daily new cases in different countries, and then turning on different measures depending on where people are coming back from based on monitoring, it kind of all seems like it makes a bit more sense than when the government were first sort of dealing with coronavirus. Do you think they've sort of got a handle on this, even if it is sometimes awkward for holidaymakers?
Yeah, I think if you're taking a holiday, that's just the price you're going to have to pay, right? I mean, if we really wanted to nail down on this, we could say, 2 weeks quarantine for everybody who leaves the country and comes back. I think that would be a perfectly fair thing to do, actually. not fair. It would certainly be effective. And ultimately, a holiday is a luxury. So I think, why not? I don't see what I find interesting is that somewhere like Malta, for instance, I mean, the incidence of cases has gone up 150%, but you have to, remember Malta is a very small country. It's about 350, 400,000 people. It was actually doing very well. I mean, so it's going to be less unfair for some places than others. Equally with Spain, it was particularly egregious in Catalonia, in the north, in the east of the country, but then in the south, in the Basque Country, it was, the incidence was incredibly low. Yet people returning from the Basque Country were subject to the same measures as people coming from Catalonia. So yeah, there's some aspects of it are going to be unfair. But I mean, look, you're taking a holiday during a global pandemic. I mean, that's just going to be come on.
I agree. That's why I'm not going on holiday. This
is one thing I will not bash the Tories on. Because look at what Vietnam has had incredibly low incidence because they basically, if you leave the country, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks. But it's not like, go home and don't leave for 2 weeks. The government is monitoring you for 2 weeks, right? I mean, we could do that instead. I personally would prefer this to that. This might not work, by the way. This might not be particularly effective. We don't know, but it's an area where I will agree with the Tories.
We've got a couple more comments. I mean, I kind of agree with you there. Scott Waitman with a £9.57 super chat says, "Hi, Michael. Would you wish my wonderful mum, Alison Waitman, a happy birthday for this Sunday? She loves the show and really values your work." I would be absolutely delighted to wish a happy birthday to your mum, Alison Waitman, on Sunday. And we appreciate your kind support. We hope you have a wonderful day. Pie Man with a £2 chat says, "When will Aaron Bastani debate Mike Gapes?" I don't know if there's... Do you want to debate Mike Gapes?
What's there to debate?
Yeah, I'm not sure what you debate, to be honest.
What's there to debate? I mean, there's many people, actually. I think we need to debate more people from the right. I mean, Michael and I probably have a mind on this.
Yep, no, I'd like to get more right wings on, but I feel like Mike Gapes is probably a bit of a has-been. I mean, where's the...
He was an
MP, maybe.
Oh, anyway.
Nishat 1976 of 1999 says, "Left is best," which is great, I suppose, message for ending the week on. Thank you, everyone, for your super chats tonight. If you want to support us directly, then do go to novaramedia.com/support. It's been a pleasure being joined by Aaron Bastani on this Friday evening. We'll be back on Monday at 8 p.m. Make sure you hit subscribe. You've been watching Tysky Sour on Novara Media. Good night.